Good morning, everybody. We'll be reading from 1 Corinthians 15, 35 through 52, 58. I'm glad somebody knew. The resurrection body. But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? You foolish person. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies, and what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each of the seed its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one of a kind, and the glory of the earth is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for the stars differ from star in the glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead, what is sown is perishable, and what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus, it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is the first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from earth, and a man of dust. The second man is from heaven, and was the man of dust, so also those who are of the dust, and as in the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkle of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. And when the perishable puts on imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the glory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abound in the word of the Lord. Know that the Lord, your labor is not in vain. Amen.
Thank you, Marvin. Okay, well, hopefully I know what to say. No, it'll be all right. You can take a seat. So for about 2 years, about 2020 to 2022, the world kind of shut down. As the coronavirus spread, and as different countries took precautionary measures to prevent its spread, people found themselves in their homes. People found themselves afraid to go outside. People found themselves sick. That went on for about 2 years, as we all know. And then as that was winding down, Vladimir Putin invaded the Ukraine and led to a massive global instability, economic instability. We've seen gas prices go high. We see just instability all around us. And then as that's going on, we also see rising tension between us and China, the next new superpower. And of course, I could go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. But the reason I highlight these particular instances is because I think that when we look at the cumulative effect of these global headlines, I think that it leads many of us to come to the conclusion that this world does not feel like home. Of course, it's not just our world that doesn't feel like home. I think for many of us, America doesn't necessarily feel like home. I know particularly as I speak with those who've maybe lived in America for many, many years, and some of them will look back to an era in the past where things felt more like home, and changes that have taken place make America feel less like home. Of course, for many Americans, particularly minorities, ethnic, religious, social minorities, America maybe has never really felt like home. Of course, what makes it feel like home to one person might be the very thing that makes it not feel like home to somebody else. And so we may not even agree on what it is that would make America feel like home, but the one thing we can all agree on is that it doesn't feel like home. Our world doesn't necessarily feel like home. America doesn't necessarily feel like home. Denver, Colorado may not feel like home. It's changed so much. Those of you who have lived here for many years have seen all kinds of changes. I remember when coming into Denver from the north, when 120th Avenue was the first major road that you would see. There's been so much change in the Denver area. Some of us have commented on the weather seems different. The weather's not even the same anymore. And for many, it just may not feel like home. You know, I remember talking with my dad a number of years ago, and he's lived in a lot of places. He grew up in Australia. He's lived in Indiana. He's lived in Michigan, Alabama, Wyoming, Maryland, Colorado. And he told me a number of years ago, he said, you know, Kevin, I came to this realization at some point that just no place was ever going to really feel like home. The world doesn't feel like home. America doesn't feel like home. Maybe even here in Denver doesn't feel like home. I think for some of us, sometimes our home may not feel like home. Ever been in a situation where your home didn't feel like home? Maybe your marriage struggled or is struggling, and even coming home doesn't feel like home. Maybe you've been in an abusive relationship, and home is the farthest thing from feeling like home. Maybe you're a teenager and you're just ready to leave your home because it doesn't feel like home. So the world doesn't feel like home. America doesn't feel like home. Maybe Colorado doesn't feel like a home. Maybe even your own home doesn't feel like home. And then sometimes you look in the mirror and your own skin doesn't even feel like home. You look in the mirror like, that's me? That's my home? Maybe as you get older, arthritis starts to creep in, or the knees start to act up, and just your body doesn't even feel like home. And I think that for many of us then, when we start to feel this, the world doesn't feel like home, our country doesn't feel like home, our town doesn't feel like home, our home doesn't feel like home, our own skin doesn't feel like home, that we kind of start to get this attitude. It's like, get me out of here. Evacuate. Get me out of this marriage. Get me out of this country. Get me out of my own skin. And then as Christians, this manifests itself as a longing for heaven. Ever had that? Sort of find ourselves like we're in some sort of a bad sci-fi movie where you're on a spaceship and this ship will self-destruct in 1 minute. Everybody's running trying to find an escape pod. We want to escape. We want to evacuate. Today we're continuing in our series called The Story. And the central theme of this whole series is that the Bible is a story. It's not primarily an instruction manual for life. It's not primarily a book of timeless wisdom, though it contains all the timeless wisdom you would ever need, and it contains all the instructions you would ever need. But to get at that wisdom, to get at that those instructions, from any passage, we have to read it in light of the story. The Bible is a story, and as we've seen, it unfolds in 4 acts. the first act, creation. God created everything. And he created everything to be good and to be beautiful and for there to be order. And he created us, humanity, to be in fellowship with him and to be a part of the process of bringing greater beauty and order to all of creation. But we turned away from God. We said, we don't trust you. We're going to go our own way, right? And this leads to the second act, the fall. We turn away from God, and this leads us to turn away from one another, leads to what I call the spiraling decay of humanity. That's Act 2. Then Act 3, redemption. God unveils a plan for redemption, and he calls a people, calls Abraham, and says, through you and through your people will come redemption to this world, and we've seen that culminates then in the coming of Christ, who comes to bring redemption, and then through his death and his resurrection, which is the climax of the story, then we come to the fourth and final act, right? So we've got creation, fall, redemption, but here's the thing. The fourth act, it's not creation, fall, redemption, evacuation. That's not it. It's restoration, not evacuation. You see, God's plan, his ultimate plan, is to renew and restore this world. His ultimate goal is to renew and restore this world that pointing to this day when this world will feel like home. In this passage it was read today, it points to this day when your own body will feel like home. Verses 51 through 52. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound. The dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. Paul is talking about this day when the Spirit of God will bring renewal to all of creation, and that means the resurrection of his people, the restoration of his people from the dead. It points to this day when your own body will feel like home. Now, this shouldn't surprise us, because throughout this series, we have seen that God's plan is for heaven and earth to be one. Right, we've seen this throughout the Bible. We see this, that's always been the plan, for heaven and earth to be one. That actually the story begins with heaven and earth united in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve walking in the garden with God, in fellowship with God. Heaven and earth are one. And of course, that was lost when Adam and Eve turned away from God. Now there's this separation between heaven and earth. But then what we discover throughout the scriptures is this plan for them to be reunited. We see that with the tabernacle. We saw how in the book of Genesis and then in the first 20-so chapters of Exodus, you discover that literally hundreds of years will rush by just in a few verses. But then when you get to Exodus 25, all of a sudden there are 15 chapters devoted to describing the tabernacle in painstaking detail. Of course, why is this? Because the tabernacle points to what God's ultimate plan is. The tabernacle was the place where heaven and earth come together. It's the intersection point of heaven and earth. And then, of course, moving forward, the temple, Solomon's temple, is sort of like the height of the story of the people of Israel living in Palestine. The construction of the temple, the permanent place where heaven and earth come together. In fact, you can sort of read Old Testament history as the story of God trying to get his people to worship him in the temple where heaven and earth intersect. And then this all points to and ultimately culminates in Jesus, as we saw. Jesus comes and begins to do things that were only supposed to be done at the temple or done by those who were officials in the temple. He starts healing people. He starts forgiving sin. And we discover that Jesus has become the temple. He has become the place where heaven and earth intersect. And then we saw that the church, to be followers of Jesus, means that we carry on that same mission, that we have the purpose of being the place where heaven and earth come together in part, not in full, but in part. We have the opportunity even now to be the place where heaven and earth come together. But of course, the question that emerges then is, what will it look like when heaven and earth fully come together? Not just in part as it is now, right? What will it look like when heaven and earth fully come together? And this is what Paul is describing here in 1 Corinthians 15. And I think that when we ask this question, what will it look like when heaven and earth fully come together? And as Paul was wrestling with this thought in his own mind, I think one word emerges to describe what it will look like. And here's what it is: mystery. It's a mystery. What's clear is he's trying to describe something he does not know how to describe. Listen to this. Well, verse 51 just says, I tell you a mystery. And then he goes on, he just tries to describe it. He tries to describe what will happen when the Spirit comes, when God raises his people from the dead. And you can tell he's kind of scrambling for words. It's as if the language that he has, that there just aren't words to describe what it is that he's trying to describe. And so he uses different images. He uses the image of a seed that is planted, and then of course it flourishes, it turns into a plant or whatever, and he says that's what it's like when you die. It's like the seed that's buried, and then it changes into this tremendous tree or whatever it is. And says that's actually what the resurrection of God's people will be like. But the point is, there's continuity there, right? It's just like it's the seed that turns into this thing. It's your body that will be transformed into this whatever it is that is really hard for me to describe. And then he goes in trying to describe what will this new kind of life be like, this new physicality, right? It's clear it's a physicality, it's a spirit-empowered physicality, and he talks about, well, there's already, he's like, as an analogy, he's like, well, there's already different kinds of physicality. Like fish have one kind of physicality, and birds have physicality, and even like the heavenly bodies, they have their own kind of physicality, and he's just trying to say, like, it's just, there's different kinds, and this is mysterious, what God is going to do. But what he's going to do is renew and restore this world. This is his point. And this is one of the reasons why throughout history Christians have traditionally buried the dead, not gone to cremation. Because in burying, you are pointing to this reality of God's plan to restore this world, to raise his people from the dead, not simply for us to escape to somewhere else. Now, you start talking about this whole idea of God raising people from the dead, and I've had conversations with people about this, and they're like, so wait a minute, Pastor, like, is this like zombie apocalypse? And I'm like, well, I don't know that Dawn of the Dead or something like that is really what is quite what you should be thinking. Okay, no, it's not really that. I said, but I will say this: you have to use your imagination if you want to comprehend this. Your only hope of grasping this mystery is through using your imagination. C.S. Lewis talks about the importance of the imagination for comprehending the things of God, and in particular for comprehending what God will do. And it's in this vein that he also talks about the importance of myth, that we need to receive the story of the gospel as myth. Now that may sound strange because in our modern world, people think that myth means false. But that's actually not what myth traditionally means. Here's a better way of understanding what myth is. Myths are stories that give voice to our deepest human longings. That's what myths are. They're stories that give voice to our deepest human longings. And the reality is it not true that our deepest human longings are of mythical proportion? I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I was like 11, 12 years old. And I had a few-year period when I was really into basketball. And I would dream, I would imagine, I would envision myself becoming a professional basketball player. Now, when I did this, I did not dream. I didn't dream like, Kevin Hanley, drafted in the 4th round by the Minnesota Timberwolves. He's, averaged 11 points a game, 3 rebounds, 2 assists, played for 8 years, and then retired. No, what I envisioned was this. Did you see that game last night? Kevin Hanley dunked. He jumped from behind the 3-point line. He's the first person to ever score a triple-triple. He got 103 assists, 122 rebounds, and 522 points. It was unbelievable. Right? Our deepest human longings are of mythical proportion. And that's what myths are. They give voice to these deepest of human longings. This is why stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the X-Men, Marvel, that's why these are so popular. That's why Marvel just keeps cranking these things out. Because they tell these myths that touch at these deepest human longings. And Lewis would say we need to expand our imagination in order to comprehend the gospel, because it is of mythical proportion. We must receive it as myth. Of course, as Lewis goes on, and this is the point, he goes on to highlight in one of his famous essays that the gospel must be received as myth, but what makes it so unique is that it is the myth that became fact. He taught literature at Oxford University, and so he understood how literature worked. And so he saw that the gospel story, it reads just like myth. In this sense, it would read like the Iliad or the Odyssey, but then what he also noticed is that it was very unique and very different from these other myths, in that what you saw, and there was no, without precedent in the history of literature, was that these myths were being told as if they actually happened. The kind of detail, the realistic detail that is involved in the gospel stories was unparalleled in the history of myth-telling. And it was precisely because what the writers were trying to say is that, this myth has become fact. In fact, all of these myths, the Odyssey, the Iliad, they're all pointing towards the gospel. And the gospel then is the answer to all of those longings that became a reality in the 1st century historical context of Jesus. And so Lewis is like, this is fact. But to comprehend it, we must receive it also as myth. This is why I would encourage you, watch the Marvel movies as a matter of spiritual formation. You need to be able to expand your imagination if you're going to be able to grasp at all the story of the gospel. Right? I was just last night, I had dinner with an old friend who was in town. He's from New Jersey, and he was on town for business, and we met, and he's I don't really know where he is spiritually. He's not really a church goer, but there's some sort of. But he asked me. He said, "What are you preaching on tomorrow?" And I was like, I think he was, you're going to preach on how to have a good marriage, or how what are some tips for raising your children. I'm like, actually, I'm preaching on the restoration of all things. And he's just like deer in the headlights, right? And I don't know if he believes or not. I mean, a lot of people don't believe, and you know why they don't believe? Because it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And if you don't receive it as myth, if you can't allow your imagination, you will never be able to comprehend this. God's plan is for heaven and earth to fully come together as one, and we need myth to be able to comprehend this. Okay. So now I will get practical. What does this mean for us today? 3 implications for us today. And 3 implications that kind of revolve around 3 questions. And these are 3 questions which you can ask of any biblical text. In fact, I use these all the time. I use these in our community group when we meet Wednesday nights. Wednesdays we have like a potluck dinner, and then we have a low-key Bible study. It has to be low-key because there's kids. I mean, you never know when you're praying or when you're reading if you're going to get hit with a Nerf dart in the forehead. So it's just kind of crazy time. So it's kind of a low-key Bible study. And so I have these 3 questions that you can ask of any text. One of them is, what does this passage tell us about God? What does this passage tell us about us? And then how now shall we live in light of what we know about God and what we know about us? So I want to ask those 3 questions of this text. First of all, what does this tell us about God? Well, it tells us a lot of things, but there's one thing I want to highlight here for us today. What this shows us is that God does not give up. He doesn't give up on things and say, you know what? I'll just start with something totally new. You see this? In other words, the gospel is not that God is going to make something totally new. It's that God is going to renew all things. And this is where I would say that the gospel is a whole lot more like the TV show Fixer Upper than The Price is Right. Right? The Price is Right is all about getting something brand new. A new car, a new boat, a new house. I don't know if they actually do new houses, but brand new, right? Whereas Fixer Upper, what do Chip and JoJo do? They go into something old and they make it new. You see, that's what the gospel is. It's God making new that which is old and broken down. And of course, when you make something new, there is often a part of the process is demolition. Sometimes you got to knock things, in Fixer Upper, there's 5-10 minutes in each show where Chip, he's going around with a hammer and knocking walls down and tearing stuff out, right? That's part of the renewal process. And the Bible talks about that as well. That's what judgment is. God's judgment is the demolition phase of renewal. The book of Revelation, the first 19 chapters or so, is about the demolition phase of the renewal of all things. But it's tearing things down. It's rooting out that which is ugly or broken or bad, pulling it out so that the whole thing can be renewed. Because God doesn't give up. Friends, God doesn't give up. He doesn't want to give up on your marriage. Everybody's situation is different, for sure. And there are, of course, times when, for various reasons, a marriage dissolves. And that's true. But the truth is, God's ultimate plan is normally to renew that which is broken, to renew your marriage, to make it new, bring it back to life. God's plan is to renew you in all of your brokenness and all of your ugliness, beginning now, but ultimately in eternity, we see this will happen. He wants to renew you, not get rid of you and get something else instead. God makes things new, doesn't just start something new. This is one of the reasons, as you may know, we are part of the Calvary family of churches here at Calvary North Glen. And the Calvary family of churches over the last 12 years has been heavily involved in 2 things, church planting and church replanting. And so church planting is about starting new churches, brand new churches. But one of the things that's unique about the Calvary family of churches is that we don't believe in just starting new churches. We believe in the importance of renewing and restoring old churches, churches that are struggling. Right? This is exactly what Calvary North Glen was all about, and I want you to see the theology behind it. We renew churches because that's God's plan, is to renew and restore all of creation. Because God doesn't give up. What does this passage tell us about God? God doesn't give up. Okay, secondly, what does this passage tell us about us? The best is yet to come. The best you is yet to come. there will come a day when you will see you unchained, unhindered. Isn't it true? I think that for many of us, we look at ourselves and we look at our lives, especially as you get older, and these two words start to pop into your head. If only. If only I'd had a more stable upbringing. If only I hadn't gotten sick at that pivotal time in my career. If only I hadn't gotten into that horrible relationship. Man, look what I could have done. We look at ourselves and we see all of this potential and we say, man, if only, look what I could have been. Friends, the heart of the Christian faith is that your best is yet to come. There's a great short story by J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, called Leaf by Niggle. And it's been a while since I read it, so I might get it wrong, but it's this story about this guy named Niggle. And he's an artist. And he starts to draw a painting of a tree. I think it's a tree, and but he doesn't finish it because he's got to go to work, right? So he's painting. He has to stop, goes to work, and then I can't remember what happened, but he goes to work, and then he never gets back to it, and then he ends up anyway. Later on in the story, it's like he's totally moved on from that, and now he's like walking through a forest. I think I'm skipping a lot here, and I think that the forest this is supposed to kind of point to the age that is to come. And he's walking through this forest, and all of a sudden he sees a tree that looks really familiar. And he gets close, and he realizes that the tree that in the forest that he's walking in, the tree that's there is the tree that he was painting. But now it's not just a painting, it's the actual tree in all of its glory and all of this forest. It's that this idea that he had when he was painting back then has come to beyond anything he could have imagined. And the point of this story is saying this is what the new heavens and the new earth will be like. That God has made us and created us and gifted us to be a part of bringing beauty and order to all of creation. And when heaven and earth are restored, we will be unchained. We will be freed to fully become who God intends for us to be, that in this world is always being held back. And it's being held back because heaven and earth are not fully one. There will come a day when you will fully become who you were designed to be, all for the glory of God. Not for you, but all for the glory of God. You see, friends, when we understand the gospel, there's no more if-onlys. Because the best is yet to come. Okay, what does this tell us about God? What does this tell us about us? And then finally, how does this affect how we live now? Again, there's a lot I could say, but I'm just going to highlight one thing. The things that we do in this world matter. Precisely because it's this world that God is going to renew and restore, the things that we do in this world matter. When we see this, it's interesting how this whole passage ends. Therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor is not in vain. What he's saying is that the things that you do now, the things that you do in this world, they matter because they will contribute to the age that is to come. Now, I like to think of it this way. It's the difference between going on a vacation and going on a staycation. Right, when you go on a vacation, have you ever had this before? And you're like, oh man, the dishes are, they haven't been done and there's laundry on, and the house is a mess. And you're like, well, don't worry about it. Who cares, man? We're going to be sitting on the beach in a few days here. Don't worry about the house. We're getting out of here. We're evacuated. Who cares what the house looks like? Because we're not even going to be here. But if you go on a staycation, which is where, you're free to do it, but you're gonna spend time in your own house, well, now you're like, okay, let's do the dishes, let's do the laundry, because it's going to be a part of that age that is to come. And you see, the point is, I think a lot of Christians, we have this attitude like, well, I'm leaving this world, so who cares what goes on here? No, the point is what we do here matters, because it's the same world that will be renewed and restored, and we have the opportunity, even if just in part, to contribute to that which will come. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright puts it this way, and I'll just leave you with this. He says, every act of love, gratitude, and kindness, every work of art or music inspired by the love of God and delight in the beauty of his creation, every minute spent teaching a severely handicapped child to read or to walk, every act of care and nurture, of comfort and support for one's fellow human beings, and for that matter, one's fellow non-human creatures, and of course, every prayer, all Spirit-led teaching, every deed that spreads the gospel, builds up the church, embraces and embodies holiness rather than corruption, and makes the name of Jesus honored in this world. All this will find its way through the resurrecting power of God into the new creation that God will one day make.